In this conversation, David Helmer joins Louis Casadia. David's an expert in artificial intelligence, and they discuss the complexities and implications of AI technology. He explains the difference between traditional AI and machine learning, the infrastructure behind AI models, and the potential dangers of AI in criminal law, particularly with the rise of deepfakes. The conversation also touches on the philosophical debate surrounding AI consciousness and the responsibilities of developers in creating AI systems. Helmer emphasizes that while AI can perform complex tasks, it lacks the true understanding and emotions, and the legal implications of its use are still evolving.
Today we have Mr. David Helmer. He is the founder of NTTW Consulting. He has a PhD in mechanical engineering, and he was previously a principal staff member at the Applied Physics Lab, as well as a professor at West Point. We're here to talk about artificial intelligence, and we'll touch on some things to do with criminal law, but I think we're going to talk more probably just about the general implications of AI, which pretty much touch every aspect of life. So David, why don't we start with this? Tell me what AI is. Like, I'm a stupid layperson. I don't know anything about technology except what buttons to press on my phone. Like, what is artificial intelligence?
Well, it's a pretty good place to start, and it's not your fault you don't know, because it turns out there isn't actually a definition. There's about 50 competing ones out there, but there's no community agreement out in the world. And so most people these days, when they're talking about AI, are actually talking about a subcategory called machine learning, which is quite different from what it was supposed to be when they conceived of AI back, 60 years ago now. But basically, when someone tells you that they're using AI, they're telling you that they're using a computer is about the only thing you can be sure about. And then it's probably a pretty good bet that they're using something trained to find patterns in data. And the details of what they're using to find the patterns and what data they're finding patterns on is really where a lot of the successes and the problems come from. Right now, you'll see AI in everything from, or what people call AI, everything from, say, ChatGPT or any of those large language models, down to the spam filters if you use Outlook. Those are also AI enabled. They have been for about 20 years if you consider machine learning AI. So it's both very new when we talk about these generative capabilities like ChatGPT, but it's also something that we've had for decades and decades. The term goes back, like I said, about 60 plus years.
So tell me then, like, for me, like, all right, I hop on Google, right? And I type in something, and I type in like a big long sentence question, and let's go back in time, like 5 years, 10 years, right? I go on Google and I do that, right? Now they have, I think it's like Gemini, they're calling it, right? And you get that AI answer at the top. What is the difference between what I did 10 years ago, right? But Google turned my sentence into a bunch of results that were similar to what I was asking for, right? What is the difference between that and what's happening now?
Yeah, so in at a relatively simplified level, a lot of what Google and the search engines in the past used were essentially looking for, when I see these words, like it looks like these words show up here. It's almost like keyword matching. It's not exactly, but it's pretty close. And you might have seen that it was pretty robust if you had a typo, right? If you meant to type product and you misspelled it, it would still find it because it was looking for things that were close. Things like Gemini and things, which is a cousin to, again, ChatGPT or whatever of those models you want to use, are an evolution of those in the sense that they are still machine learning things that are trained on data, which is how Google worked as well. It was trained on data. But now they're generative. They actually are using generally what's called a transformer. And all that is doing is it's essentially taking your prompt and it's saying, based on this, what is the thing that this person most expects to see based on what's in the data? The way that it does that, it's what's called a transformer, or GPT. That T stands for transformer. And it's looking essentially for this neural network, which is one of these architectures for AI. We can get into those if we need to, but it's looking at essentially what's activated and what's nearby in the math space. And it's just pulling it forward for you. So it's not doing any interpretation. It doesn't understand what you're asking it. It's saying, based on these tokens, which is how it breaks up the world, what is the next token that this person expects to see? And that can be incredibly powerful, and it can also be really challenging. In the past, it wasn't doing any of that inference. It wasn't generating content for you. it was just looking for the things that had the thing you typed in it. And so that transition is really not about getting away from machine learning, but rather some of the mechanisms by which it learns and then the nature of the content that it generates. Or, in the case of search results, again, it's not generating anything.
So when I go on like ChatGPT or Google and I type in a question and it's looking out in the ethos of available information to it, which in Google's case is like Earth, right? And it's looking at all this information and it's pulling this stuff together, and then I imagine there's some sort of very complex code and how to take that information and then put it into sentences of providing an answer. Where does that exist physically? Is it on a computer chip, like on a server? Where is ChatGPT? Like, where is its processing power?
Yeah, so that's a fun, it depends. So the initial training of those models when they build them is essentially done on a giant bank of computers. Very, very large, right? That's why you see these companies investing billions and billions of dollars into this infrastructure. When you're using it, that may not be the case. So they do have, you'll hear them referred to as on-prem or local solutions. There are lightweight models that live, for example, on your phone that do not reach back to the internet intentionally because security, for example, if you were hypothetically a law firm and you didn't want to be putting your client's data out into the world, there are solutions that allow you to take these models that were trained here, essentially put in a box and provided to you to use locally. So the answer is it depends, and it usually shows up in either the purchase agreement or the terms of use as to where your data goes. If you're using generic ChatGPT, your prompts are actually available generally to OpenAI in that case, but again, I don't want to pick on them. It could be any of them, and they can actually be used in training. So if you have something very specific to a client that you have uploaded there, even if you never did their name, but there's enough data there that one could do an inference, your questions might show up hypothetically down the road in a response to someone else's prompts, which is not great. Now that doesn't, that is mostly hypothetical. There's a lot of data out in the universe, but it's plausible.
So part of this machine learning is literally learning from the questions being asked of it.
It can be. So there's, yeah. So there's
all of that. And so is there like a Skynet, like headquarters, like big machine, like central nervous system for like ChatGPT, or is it really just like in existence within multiple different computers and microchips like throughout their,
yeah. So
throughout equipment everywhere?
Functionally, there's not much of a difference. So they do, again, for training and stuff, hold things very locally in certain locations. But ultimately, when somebody talks about the cloud, they're really just talking about somebody else's computer. And so all of that processing is happening from your perspective on somebody else's computer somewhere else when you're talking to the internet. Who owns that computer is going to be Google or OpenAI or whoever. And again, they don't always learn from what's being put into them. And in fact, like these large language models, they don't retrain them very often, which is one of the misconceptions. So people think that AI means that it's continually learning, but in fact, it usually isn't. Because retraining something like ChatGPT is a very expensive process. And so if you actually ask ChatGPT, it will tell you, well, I mean, prior to the GPT-5 release, it would say, oh, I was actually trained in 2023. They did an update in 2024, which then creates the problem of when you query it, it's actually pulling data from 23, 24 and might not have stuff from today. But those computers are physically sitting at a, Google or whoever's facility generally. Tracing exactly where a certain query goes can be quite a challenge depending on exactly how things are configured and might not go anywhere if you have
Actually, like you have this code that is figuring out how to interpret information, and then you have the information itself, which exists scattered throughout, either the internet or different cloud servers, and like it's reaching all over the place for this information, and then the processing part could exist as simply on your phone because they have the code then embedded in your phone. And, maybe it doesn't work as fast and as efficiently as like a supercomputer that's in the lab, but like on phones are pretty advanced now. So I guess it's able to operate, efficiently enough to answer your question about where the best hot dogs are.
So typically, if you're using it on a local version, right, your phone, your laptop, your work computer, the reason that you do that is you don't want it talking to the internet because you don't want your data out there, right? You don't want your queries saved, whatever. So typically what a lot of those are doing, you're actually pulling from a curated data set. So it's trained on the universe. It's trained on the internet, basically, right?
And that's within its code.
Right. And that's essentially what goes into how it works. The code is how it uses the data. The data affects the results of the code.
Is the code embedded? Is the data embedded into the code so that it doesn't have to search out there?
No, so essentially your code is a way to find patterns in the data, whatever the data happens to be. And so hypothetically, you could be using a different set of data with the same code. They're actually separate, but if you train on different data with the same code, you'll get a totally different result. And that's what you see with some of the edits that get pushed, or some of the things that you'll find when you sort of try to retrain ChatGPT locally and it learns from your queries and things like that, or sort of these micro local updates that are a little bit different. Did we just lose connectivity?
Yeah.
So anyway,
you dropped out.
Apologies.
You're back
so
now.
so the gist is that if you're using it locally, typically what you're trying to do is keep your data, and not have your query touch the internet in an uncontrolled way. And so if you have one of these local installs, it may be able to reach the internet without essentially exposing your query because of data security, or you might actually, in some of the contexts I've worked, the whole thing sits offline. Nothing's touching. You trained it, it learned. Now I took that trained model and I stuck it on a computer that can't ever talk to the internet again. And the only data that it can access is the things that it learns before, the patterns, right? Might give it access to a new set of data. So if I'm the government, right, I can put certain data sets into there that maybe aren't out in the public eye, and I can use those to help answer questions from a controlled data set in principle.
And I guess to end our like scientific apophication, the science fiction of the runaway AI, Skynet, what have you, right? Are we in the realm of the type of advanced artificial thinking that we see in science fiction?
We're far. And it's funny because it can really look like you're close because of the way these systems work. But the computer doesn't want anything. It doesn't have emotion. Like, it's not trying to take over the world. That doesn't mean things aren't dangerous. When you set an objective function, right, you tell it, I want to achieve this, and it does math.
That's the
Right.
most basic part of it, is that like this is your task. Like Gemini, I imagine, is like your task is to give the best answer possible, right?
Go math this and get to an answer. And you can do incredibly dangerous things on purpose or by accident with that. Some of the social media things that have happened are because they had AI essentially designed for an objective, which was to increase clicks, right? And that forced the algorithm, when you hear about the algorithm, like, it's not a malicious thing, but it is doing damage because it's really good at that. But it's not thinking and it's not intelligence. It's just finding patterns. It's like a really smart parrot.
Yeah.
And so when you start talking about Skynet, the Terminator, right, all of those things, self-learning machines, like, machines can write code. They can do it today. But that's not the same as having cognition the way that you or I do, and wanting things and needing things and trying to do those things. And GPT-5 itself will tell you that it doesn't do that. And there's not really a path from where they are to that, because all they're doing right now always is just pattern matching on data. That's all it is. And again, that doesn't make it not powerful, but it is pretty different when you start talking about things that are hard to encode in data. When you start thinking about sort of conceptual things, morality, ethics, the law, and sort of how we would think about some of those things, they become very hard to put into code and learn from data. And if you can't pattern match it, today's AI is not on a path to do it. And that's why you see some of this weird stuff where you'll ask the AI for the next 10 races on the West Coast, and you'll get a list of 10 races, and like it's totally wrong. Some of the races happened 3 weeks ago. Like this, I posted one of these on LinkedIn, which just sort of to prove the point of, hey, like, look, this race already happened, and like these races, but you left out Oregon. I asked you about the West Coast because it doesn't understand the West Coast because it hasn't found that pattern. And so until we get to a point where we're not really reliant on that, it's not that we won't be able to do useful things, but we won't be at a place where we're talking about Skynet or anything
To build off of that, I don't know. Have you ever seen the movie I, Robot with Will Smith?
Mhm.
And for those who have never seen that movie, it's a great movie. Will Smith, classic, going around smashing robots. But essentially, there is a bunch of robots that, help humanity out. People have them in their house. They help cook. They do all these things. And then there's a central nervous system, like computer in a headquarters somewhere that sort of runs the show. And in that movie, it wasn't so much a Skynet, like we're going to destroy the human race. It was the program became so advanced that it used its own programming to justify trying to take the world over because it was going to save humanity and prevent it from destroying itself. Is that what we have today? Isn't that a more, I don't want to say possible, but a more like, like in the worst case scenario, if someone leaves a comment out somewhere, maybe that could happen.
Yeah, and it's less so. And by the way, that was taken from Asimov. I mean, that concept is that movie was an adaptation of science fiction from 60 years ago, from a long time ago.
Mm-hmm.
And that concept of you specified the wrong objective and you got an unexpected result, that happens all the time today. Now, does that mean that these super intelligent computers are going to be able to suddenly hack into systems they're not connected to do things, right? So, hey, you teach it to play Go or chess, some of the canonical problems. Well, if you have it on a timer, one of the ways you could win the game is to launch a missile strike on the opponent's house, and hey, you'll always win. So hypothetically, could the computer like do that? I mean, in science fiction, yes. In practice, it's not connected in any way that will allow it to do that. So you can absolutely get some of those unintended consequences, and social media is the prime example of that, where the AI was generated to create clicks and drive interest, right? And there wasn't necessarily any malice behind that, but the consequences of specifying the wrong objective, telling it the wrong thing to do, and having it go after that objective in a way you didn't anticipate can cause a huge amount of damage. So Skynet, again, no, specifically Vicky from that movie, probably not, but
Vicky's
unintended
more
consequences.
Skynet, but
unintended consequences, absolutely, and we see them today. This isn't hypothetical. Whether it's Facebook, there's been some examples in criminal justice with things like sentencing recommendations, and all of these things are real. There's been some good books. My favorite's Weapons of Math Destruction, which was a great book written a few years ago. There's been a couple updates to it now, but all of these things where it's not that the algorithm is evil or bad, it's that you told it to do the wrong thing and bad things happened.
Right. Alternatively, though, us being human beings and always looking for better ways to kill each other, if a malevolent government or rogue organization were to create an AI with a directive of destroy America, like generally, like, I mean, you could be more specific, but like destroy America's infrastructure. Could that AI then, on its own, develop ways to get into infrastructure systems and damage them or destroy them? Like, is that something that is plausible, like in today's world of AI?
Yes and no. So there are things that you can do with AI that are dangerous to national security. That is, in fact, some of the stuff I used to work on in my previous job. I advised the government in this space. Giving a vague objective like I want to destroy the U.S., the AI can't handle it. It doesn't really know what that means, and it's going to go on whatever sites it's been trained on, whatever in its data, and it's going to go find the plans that somebody has made, essentially, and maybe make some inferences from that. For more directed things, like AI has already been weaponized. The classic example is probably things like chatbots for disinformation, right? A lot of those are AI enabled as part of a larger campaign to do things. And we see that, like, that ability to influence people and influence operations is a very real thing. Similarly, if you wanted to do things that were related to financing terrorism, there are some really problematic ways that you can do things like that are AI enabled. So aspects of the problem that you can articulate that would enable you to do other things are very real. There's real conversations about things like, hey, it's really exciting to do drug discovery with AI. Well, if you can discover drugs, what else can you discover? So you have to be really careful about some of those sort of dual use things, and they do exist, but they're not some meta intelligence. If you like Bond movies, the old Blofeld with the cat, that's not AI. The AI is the thing that's helping map out, okay, based on what's been out there and what's been successful, these are some of the avenues. And then doing things at scale, AI tends to be pretty good at. I can generate a bunch of chatbots. I can generate a bunch of accounts. I can generate a bunch of dummy websites. Like, I can do all those things. And even if 90% of them are garbage and they look dumb and they don't fool anybody, right? Whatever, it does. I only need 1 or 10, right? And I can still do things with that scale that with a bunch of humans, monkeys on keyboards, I couldn't do before. So there are real threats, but they're not these existential genius threats. They're really more as enablers to a bunch of things in most cases.
And I think, I think that's a good shifting point, and it touches on criminal law, is this idea of just creating false information, and particularly the creation of fake videos and photos, right? Like, I mean, have you dealt with that at all in your career? Like legitimate criminal cases being litigated based upon a fake video of someone stealing something or something, like anything. I mean, I'm just naming that, but like, you tell me, is that something you've seen?
Yeah, so I have not been involved in the criminal prosecution of anybody for that. However, I have been involved in a number of studies, discussions, projects related to what that threat is and what one could do with it, whether at a large scale or a small scale. And so deep fakes have been around for a while. For those who aren't familiar, a deep fake is basically a computer-generated version of a person, a voice,
Right,
whatever.
like 5 years ago, people would say that phrase and I'd be like, it's bullshit. Right now, I sit there and struggle to figure out if the 10-second video clip on my Facebook scrolling is real or not.
Right,
And we've very quickly have come very far in the creation of artificial videos and pictures. I think that is that particular niche has like skyrocketed.
Exactly. And that is, from a criminal perspective, potentially quite dangerous, right? In a number of ways. One is, like, you can create victims that way. Deepfake pornography being the obvious one, right? We're seeing it right now.
New laws to make that illegal. New Jersey passed a law on that.
And what was interesting about that one, right, is that it wasn't that non-consensual pornography wasn't illegal before. The question was essentially whether, if it was AI generated and hadn't happened, whether that was actually non-consensual pornography. Like, you weren't allowed, as far as I know, in most places, to video someone having sex without their knowledge and post it on the internet. In most places. But the argument essentially was, well, I'm not actually doing that. They didn't actually do this. This is, creative content, right? And we've seen that. And by the way, it just came up again with Grok and Taylor Swift. Like, this is a thing that is happening now. And so the answer is, like, criminalized activity in that way, right? Absolutely. Whether it's creating information, creating a fake video of somebody doing something. And then, by the way, like, you get into some blackmail and other things that one can do with that, right? I've created this non-consensual pornography of you. I'm going to put it out in front of your kid's school or whatever, right? Like, there's stuff that you could do with that, and you could do it in intelligence context.
You need one photo of someone. You need one picture of their face,
One picture, right? You could generate a picture. And again, like, you might generate 20,000 deep fake images, and you only need one to be good, and that's a problem. And then, like, there is technology to detect these fakes. Now,
that was the next question I was going to ask you, is how like, is the development of technology to identify what's fake and what's not keeping pace with the technology of making it more fake?
Yeah, it's a constant battle, right? Because early on, you would see things like, and it still happens, by the way, like, the woman's feet are over the ground when she's walking in the video or something, right?
Yeah. But it's getting better.
It's getting better, right? And so you can write, there are certain signatures and certain things, and it becomes a cat and mouse game, right? They actually have these things called generative adversarial cases where they have a thing that generates fakes and they have a thing that detects fakes, and they just compete with each other so that they train each other. I learned, oh, this is the one that got detected. This is what I learned. I'm going to now learn to generate, and vice versa. And so the answer is, for a lot of the traditional things that have been out there, yeah, you can detect them, but people are always coming up with new, and you're always coming.
Like,
So it's
reach a point though where like it's so good that you can't detect if it's real or not, because at the end of the day, what's a video? It's a bunch of pixels, right? It's a bunch of coded pixels of different colors put next to each other, right? So eventually, doesn't the AI get to a point where it just creates a picture so perfectly that it might as well just be real?
it potentially could, but the caveat to that is in most criminal cases, right? You have other data available, and so not only does it have to generate a picture that looks totally real, but let's assume that it is that one of your clients as a criminal attorney is facing something where somebody has fabricated evidence that shows a picture of them doing something illegal at a certain time, right? Well, you potentially have any number of places you can go to get information on where they actually were. You can get information on what it actually would have looked like. Oh, they were allegedly in this room. Well, this is what this room looks like if you took this photo the way that this allegedly was from the metadata, because in an image, there's typically metadata of how it was acquired. You can reverse engineer a lot of that. Now it's hard and it's expensive right now. And so it becomes, right, you start running into a resource constraint. But the ability to take a look at, oh, this person was allegedly at this hotel at 3:57 p.m. on Tuesday, and it's like, actually, I have 16 people in his office saying that he was sitting in his office doing his job, right? Becomes a way, like alternate sources of information and cross-checking is a lot of how we manage that even today. Because even if you can't detect the fake, and again, like individual videos tend to give you more tips than photos, just more data to work with, right? But also like deepfake chats, right? Somebody simulates a text message. All of those kind of things, like an audio clip of them.
I mean, text messages, that's a big one. I mean, that
Right.
comes up all the time. I mean, I think it would definitely, like, if you're dumping a phone and you're using Celebrate, which is a program that extracts the data, like, I don't think you can deep fake, like, data from a Celebrate extraction. You
Right.
tell me, can you?
No, so and you can't, but an audio transcript or something like that, right, where it sounds like they're on a call doing what, because calls a little
Right.
bit
I
harder
guess
to trace the
it could put
metadata than video.
photos and videos on there, and it could be
Right.
like a video of somebody with a gun, like,
Yeah,
out in front of their
or just an
house.
audio clip of them, asserting that they're part of a criminal conspiracy that they didn't even
Right.
know was going on, right?
I think too, where I think this will. Look, I haven't had a case yet where either as prosecution or defense where like this is a deep fake became a legitimate, deep rooted evidentiary issue. Like I haven't had it yet, but I'm waiting. It's not a matter of if it will happen. It will 100% happen.
Yes.
I think it's going to create eventually what I suspect will happen is that the deep fake defense will eventually become its own thing. There will be experts on both sides that are go-tos. Like, it's going to become a thing. And where I suspect it will start is with cases that involve two private citizens filing charges against one another.
Yeah.
And you see that a lot in domestic violence cases. And, you know, certainly there are plenty of cases where there's legitimate abuse.
Yeah.
I'm not here to talk about that, but I have in my career, I've seen cases where I had, as a prosecutor, I had one case, woman accused the defendant of hitting her. And what do you know? I get a video of him filming her smacking herself in the face with a shoe and then saying, I'm calling the police now. Right. So, like, you know, it does exist out there. So now you have this ability to just create a fake video. So, number one, the defendant could now create a video of her smacking herself in the face with a shoe. Right.
Or she could create one of
Or
him hitting
she
her.
could create a video or
So,
text messages that
so the,
say, like, I'm sorry I hit you or something. Like, just
so
simple.
the,
It doesn't have to be, like, very
well, and
advanced.
she doesn't
And
need AI to generate
yeah,
text from his
and I
phone,
can
right?
tell you
Like,
what scares the hell out of me is that the prosecution in at least in New Jersey is not ready to handle that type of thing, because normally, if they have a victim that comes forward with physical evidence in the form of video, pictures, text, whatever, they're not questioning, oh, is this a deep fake? No one's making that a question. That no one's made. And the first time I get a case where I have to tell a prosecutor this is a deep fake, they're gonna roll their eyes at me.
Yeah.
And and then it just is like, okay, well, how do you prove it's real then?
Yeah, so good news and bad news, right? So the good news is generating really good ones is still requires a fair amount of work, expertise, and resources. You can generate things that kind of to the casual eye look pretty good like that, right? If you prompt Canva,
pictures and videos, text messages, I imagine you can
well, text messages you just
easily.
clone the person's phone and you can text whatever you want. I don't need AI for that. But when you're talking about like generating the banging themselves with the shoe video or the video of him hitting her on an alleged security camera in the house, right? Now look, you could pull the video data from the house, right? You could use that to train your background so that you knew what it was supposed to look like. You have video of him. Like you have a decent data set just from if you have video in your house from which you could then train this thing to try to create it. However, right now, if you were doing that, it would be certainly to an expert detectable, and possibly even you would just find little inconsistency with close visual inspection. If you got to a true, like somebody put a lot of resources and time and effort into this, like you could alter videos and you could generate those sort of deepfakes, and like that's going to be a real problem. I agree with you. I would say that right now, like the resources to do that and the time and such, and you'd be able to look at, hey, somebody pulled all that video data down from the cloud. I wonder what they were using it for, because it makes no sense that they pulled months and months of blank video data to do, right? So there are things that you'd be able to detect in how they got to that place. And then again, some of the cross-referencing of, was he in the house at this time? Was this he or she, right? Whichever way you're going. Like you would have to do a lot of investigative work, again, which is resource and time intensive in a problematic way, but it is still doable. And again, there's also sort of the counter AI, like this piece is fake, but then you're kind of stuck in court saying that my AI is better than their AI, which is a hard argument.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely what's going to happen.
And people will see the video and they'll anchor on that. It's called anchoring bias, and you'll have to move them off it, right? So those problems are real, but right now, like you would generally be able to detect those deep fakes, and if you brought in an expert, they could do it. And the real trick is not going to be the ability to detect it. The real trick is going to be how you disincentivize it. So the falsification of evidence and things like that comes with real penalties. And my belief is that for a lot of these emerging capabilities, they're being misused in all of these ways. Liability and accountability for those sorts of things is going to be key. Because if your deep fake was created to incriminate somebody that was innocent, right? Like significant criminal repercussions would seem pretty important for that, and whoever supported it, and assigning liability and criminal liability to those people and civil liability, right, eating those costs to try to create disincentives to people using those technologies is going to be pretty important. Because if you just allow them to do it and then there's no backlash for creating false evidence, and of course it's going to explode. But if on the other hand, people are generating these capabilities, offering services of creating these videos, making them easy in certain ways, like you have to be able to attack the people who are enabling it in ways that prevent that kind of use. Otherwise, you're right. Like it's going to turn into this escalating battle, and clients who don't have resources to fight it are going to be in trouble.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we'll have to see, in the next 5-10 years where we're at. We'll come back and do another podcast at that point. Shifting gears a bit to, I would say like, not a criminal side of things. Staying on the videos and the photos, social media and YouTube and all these different places where you see these fake videos and mainly videos. Is there a push to have, and I've wondered this, and I've sat there and I thought, I really wish they'd do this, is to have a little watermark in the top right corner that says AI generated, right? And put there by Facebook, by their own AI that detects when videos are fake. Because what I'm so tired of is scrolling through videos and finding a video that shows it doesn't matter what it shows, but then being like, shit, is this real? Is it not real? Some of them are obvious, but some of them I'm like, man, like I think it's fake, but I'm not 100% sure. And
And
it's this like new thing. Like, I mean, like 2 3 years ago, we didn't like have to think about this. If we saw a video of somebody falling into the water, you know, and then everybody laughing, it was like, it's a funny video. Now it's like, is that even real? I don't
yeah,
know.
that's one of the really damaging things that's happened. And so like the cat, like there's all these cat videos, like people on the internet
Yeah,
love to
and it's just like our reality doesn't exist the way it did 2 years ago, right?
And so the question you're asking, I mean, so in principle, there's been a long-standing back and forth about how much providers hold liability for content. And you could probably pull on a digital media law expert who could speak to you for this, but essentially, the crux of it has long been: does formerly Twitter, now X, does YouTube, does whoever is posting this content and making it available on their platform have responsibility for the content that's posted on their platform? And the answer, to a degree, has been yes. Things like posting non-consensual pornography on something like YouTube, they're supposed to locate it, pull it down, etc., right? So where the line is on who owns that regulation, on how it gets enforced, is pretty important and is still evolving. So, you know, that's a real problem. The digital watermarking, they've talked about, that's actually been a topic of discussion for a few years now, as a lot of this has
I
evolved.
think it's essential. I think we are raising a generation right now who, you know, if me and you see a video of a platypus, right? We're like, oh yeah, that's a platypus. If my 6-year-old, who, let's say in a couple years she's in school and she sees a video of a platypus, she'll be like, that's not real. Like, right, because it's like a ridiculous animal, right?
Well,
It
and
has
that's
all these different parts, right? If you don't know what a platypus is, you're
right,
gonna be like, oh, that's just a fake animal.
right. And
And
so the
so
tricky,
let's
there's a
start
tricky,
there, right? And
yeah.
then think about the implications from there, which is that the generation that didn't grow up without this crap is going to have to navigate life with it existing and never having a reference point of what was real for sure, right?
Yeah. So one of the problems that we've had even before AI, but even more so now, is the lack of a shared set of facts. And that is an issue everywhere, right? Social media being a prominent one, right? Like there was after the attempted assassination, right? There was this random Italian who was accused. I think he was he was literally in Italy at the time, and people were accusing him of taking a shot at Trump. And it just propagated on, I think it was Twitter, but you know, don't quote me. But this progression, right, of misinformation and how it spreads is pretty important, whether, by the way, it's AI generated or not. When you start talking about the AI generation and tagging it, it's a little bit trickier than you think it is. First off, they have to be able to detect it, period, right? Sort of thing one. Thing two is, where do you draw the line between normal editing and, you know, AI generated, right? So if somebody's talking and the background's a little blurry, or there's some noise in the background and you use an AI filter to clean up the audio, right? Is that AI modified content? How do I identify? And then I'm not saying that's not solvable. I'm just pointing out that there's,
Yeah.
you know, there's a lot of these things everywhere. But then the probably the most problematic piece of that is, I used that phrase before, anchoring bias, which is a pretty important one here. If that video, even if it has an AI generated tag in the corner, makes it into your feed, and you see this feed of me saying terrible things about something, right? Expressing criminal intent, whatever, right? Totally fake. However, that's the first thing you saw, right? And that's the narrative that you now have to move people off of. And it's really hard to move people off of that initial anchor. It's why sales, like if you ever look at how people sell stuff, you price it at $200, even though it was never going to be $200, and then you mark it down to 50 because people are like, okay, well, it's not, I know it wasn't 200, this is reasonable, but the reality is it's worth 10. But your brain still has the 200, whether you want it to or not. Even if you knew it was nonsense, even if it said it was AI generated, the fact that you saw it and processed it, particularly for some of this visual imagery, makes it really hard to get it out of people's brains. And so not to say they shouldn't have to watermark it and they shouldn't have to regulate content, but it's surprisingly challenging to define what gets moderated. And then the other piece of it is you get the free speech argument, right? Like, this is just free expression of, you know, whatever, I'm generating creative content. It's a First Amendment problem. And that is like the crux of that, right? Where are you getting to the point where you're yelling fire in a theater? Is is a question we have not solved, in part because it's new, but in part because we were doing all of these things in misinformation before AI made it easier. So the legal problem is still the legal problem. All AI has really done is change the scale and a little bit of like the fidelity of the content.
Are there any countries or jurisdictions that have placed laws that say like, hey, you have to like watermark videos that are AI generated?
So there are some regulations out there, particularly in certain contexts. And in fact, in the US, for certain use cases within government, there was a push that you had to tag stuff as AI generated. There's been a push actually in the US for legal and other content, medical content, that says it was AI generated and AI supported.
Yeah, right. 'Cause that's important to not have
Well,
misinformation.
Well, it is, and it isn't, right? If you're talking about a legal brief that was generated with support of a GPT, I'm going to ask you questions about accuracy, but ultimately what I care about is the accuracy. I don't care that you used an AI to do it as long as it's right. And so that line becomes really important. Other countries have significantly more restriction and penalties for some AI uses. Things like the GDPR that's out there. There's so like certain data collections and use of certain data in places like the EU is actually significantly more restrictive than it is in the US. And there are penalties for doing some of these things that are more likely to be enforced and are sort of more clearly defined. And there isn't as much sort of, I won't say hiding behind the First Amendment. The First Amendment is obviously important, but the weaponization of the First Amendment to do things that are pretty clearly wrong is less prevalent because of the ways in which their laws are structured. And by the way, there's countries in which like only certain people have to tag when stuff is AI generated because the state controls the media. So sometimes it's beneficial to have these AI generated things. So I wouldn't say anybody solved it perfectly, but there are countries that are looking at the ways in which data gets out there, what data you're allowed to use, being a little bit more explicit about some of the penalization that can happen, that I think we can draw from and continue to learn from.
Do you think we're headed towards a point where there's some sort of law put in place that gives an affirmative obligation of these social media networks to watermark their videos? Like, you post a video, right? And as it's uploading, gets run through an algorithm that's also run by AI, I imagine, and it says, that looks like it might be AI, and it'll put like a watermark. Maybe they even say possibly AI, strongly supported AI. Like it could be different. I'm not even getting into that. But do you think we're heading towards that eventually, or do you think that that's never going to happen?
It's hard to predict regulation in the US given the shifts in what we regulate based on who's in power, and sort of the appetite people have for those things. So it's hard to say with certainty. I think it is a plausible place that we could be going, but I think the more likely to be successful approaches are going to be assigning liability to people when content causes problems and they hosted it. Because I think companies will rightfully argue it's really hard to tag stuff, it's hard to detect, everything's going to get a label, whatever. Like there are a number of things that they can point to, and they'll be legitimate. However, when a company has a financial incentive, set aside criminal liability, but if you can be held responsible for millions and millions of dollars for knowingly enabling X, Y, and Z, that's where I think the winners are going to be. And that's what, again, some of the original regulation in the digital space was sort of went back to try to create. That's where a lot of the Silk Road conversation came in, for those not familiar with some of the sketchy things that happen on the dark web, if you will. There are mechanisms in place for a lot of this. And one of the things that we have to avoid is falling into this trap that AI is actually changing the law. In the same way as if I burglarize your house and I do it using a crowbar, or I do it using my elbow to smash in your window and open the door, right? Like the fact that I used a crowbar is mostly incidental, right? Maybe we could talk about premeditation, whatever, right? You can talk about some of those things, but ultimately the act of breaking in your house and taking stuff is illegal. In the same way, enabling child pornography or enabling slander or enabling all of these things could in fact expose you to liability, or should. And so in a world in which that happens, companies suddenly would have a very powerful incentive to do the things that you're describing as best as they could, even if they weren't perfectly successful, much more so than trying to convince the government at large to get together and create this regulation, because there's going to be loopholes, there's going to be all these challenges associated with it. Most of the laws that we have on the books are in fact sufficient for most of the AI things that people want to do that are problematic. What we're really just doing is giving them a different hammer. We're giving them a different way to do it. So misrepresenting information in a public way that's slanderous to a person is not a thing you're really supposed to be allowed to do, right? And so recognizing that the crime isn't actually changing is fundamental to a lot of this discussion. We had this discussion a lot on the international stage when it comes to weapons. There's a lot of fear of killer robots and all of these things out there. But once you strip away the concept that AI is an agent that has intelligence, and you say that this is a piece of software or hardware that's doing a thing, we know how to do liability for that. We know how to prosecute war crimes. All of these things already exist. The AI is in some ways a smokescreen, like it's a red herring. The problem is the problem. And so I would argue that for the kind of thing that you're discussing, there may be ways to force law and policy that says you must show this, or that at a minimum, this is a way to get yourself out of liability. You have to tag it. In order to not be held liable, this is what it must be. But I suspect that the forcing factor for that will be lawsuits and liability claims against big tech, much more so than it'll be like giant government action in advance. And I don't know that I love that, but I do think that that's probably going to be the best mechanism for a lot of this.
Do you think that same question, but not government regulation, market, just regular old, like, is there a push within the industry to create that because of market demand? Is Facebook, X, YouTube, are they all working on what we talked about with having something enabled to identify quickly what is AI generated and what is not? Is that happening on its
Yeah.
own just
So
from demand?
for some of them, yes, and for some of them, no, and for kind of differing reasons. Like content moderation, there was which is a code for some of this, right? Making sure that inappropriate stuff isn't posted. Usually they're thinking about like regular pornography stuff, but AI generated falsities can be there. The certain companies have leaned in hard to that and taking out inappropriate pro-Nazi, whatever, pick your favorite sort of inappropriate content. Hate speech, right? Regulating hate speech was a big conversation. Certain companies are leaning hard into taking that off of their platforms, finding ways to detect it, finding ways to remove it, finding ways to get rid of bots that are pushing misinformation. Like certain companies have said free speech absolutism, right? Everything is there. We're actually getting rid of all our moderators. And we're going to kind of let the speech be what it is because First Amendment. And so there isn't one unified answer. And what the market so far has shown is that some people are really interested in like having content they can trust and know is real. And some people either don't know that what they're not getting is real or don't care. So I don't think there's any one unified market force, but I do think there's niches for different people in the same way as there is for, different kinds of news outlets and different kinds of things that represent, how we project information out in the world, right? And so there's not one fixed answer, but I can tell you that all of these companies have some element of the ability to look for content that is inappropriate. Where they set that bar and what kind of stuff they're looking for varies quite heavily, as does how successful they are at finding it. And so, I wish I could give you a better answer than that. And ultimately, it's going to depend on which companies end up succeeding and which companies end up failing in terms of who grows and who shrinks. And there's a lot that goes into that, unfortunately. It's not just whoever's generating the best and most trustworthy content is going to win, because some people want to see deepfake pornography of stars, right? Or of their neighbors or of whatever. And so certain platforms are going to cater to that.
And so let's shift over a little bit. We kind of marginally touched on it, but I want to talk a little bit more about this. Are we heading in a direction where at one point, whether it be 10, 20, 30 years from now, will the AI have like a level of consciousness Like, I mean, obviously right now it doesn't. It's just doing what it's being told to do. But like, is there a point where it becomes so advanced that you can't really tell the difference? Like, do you know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah. So, consciousness, no.
Yeah,
But
consciousness is probably the wrong
right.
word.
No, but I want to make the distinction because it is a little bit important here. So the AI does not have agency.
Right.
Right. So when you're thinking about legal liability, criminal liability, right, who's to blame? It is a software product, sometimes controlling a hardware product, right? Whatever it is a piece of code. If you want to get into now, what happens with a lot of these algorithms is that the person who wrote them doesn't necessarily know what they're going to do out in the wild because they're a black box and they're not explicitly coded. What you've done is you've trained it on a bunch of patterns and you've released it out into the world and you get surprised. Microsoft 10 years ago released Taybot out into the wild to learn how to interact with humans on Twitter. If you haven't heard that one, it lasted less than 24 hours because it learned to be a Nazi. Grok, like
I didn't
literally,
know
it started spewing Nazi propaganda on Twitter and they shut it down. There were also some other problematic things we don't need to go into. But Grok just did the same thing, right? There was a big thing. XAI, their LLM product, Grok, was also spouting, pro-Hitler, et cetera stuff.
What does that
And
say
so,
about our the human race?
right. But here's the thing, like it's not Nazi code. They didn't write a tool that said be a Nazi. They wrote a tool that said learn from this data, and then they didn't test it sufficiently to prove that it wasn't going to do that or whatever other problematic thing it could have done. Old versions of GPTs could tell you how to build a bomb. Not great. And then like they put in safeguards and then people were like, well, if I had a dream about making a bomb, what would that look like? And then it would tell you, right? Because
And
they're
then the
not
machine
smart.
like,
So
well, when you put it like that, let me tell you what your
exactly,
dream was like.
but that's literally what happened, right? And so the point being, the developers did not know they were going to do these things. And that will remain true in 10, 20, 30 years. And you will test your software the same as you test your software now for antivirus or whatever, right? And when your software fails right now, somebody is liable, right? If you were sold guarantees of cyber protection and your cyber protection fails, right? There's liability in place and mechanisms in place to hold people accountable for that. Product liability is product liability, and no matter how you dress it up, AI is software and it is a product. And all that's going to happen as these algorithms, and all that has happened as these algorithms have gotten more and more advanced, is that the sellers are less and less able to predict what these things are going to be able to do, particularly for things that are in like a range of context, a general purpose thing like one of these, Grok, ChatGPT, any of these LMs. So they have released these out into the wild, and no matter how advanced it is, you have released a product that does things, and some of those things are bad. Ultimately, liability is liability, guys. It's the same conversation. It's still a product. And the people who you see pushing the AI agency, which is a phrase you'll hear a lot, are people who are trying to mask the fact that ultimately somebody wrote that code and made it able to do this thing, and they don't want to be accountable for it doing an unexpected thing.
Yeah.
And the reality is that if you sell a toaster that is supposed to be a toaster and you didn't expect it to malfunction, but you sold it to be a toaster and it burned somebody's house down, product liability exists. If you sold software that you said was going to be security and it had a vulnerability that infected somebody's system, right? It's functionally not different. AI, no matter how advanced it's getting in terms of the things that it represents right now, is still just an algorithm that learns on data. So you are writing code, you are training it on data, and then you are testing it. Within that chain, if something goes wrong down the road, you either screwed up the algorithm, the data wasn't what it was supposed to be, or the tester screwed up. And the only conversation isn't about whether the AI is somehow liable or responsible. It's its fault. The responsibility is either the users because they did something inappropriate and did something that they should have knowingly known was going to be a problem, or it's the software developer's fault, whether it's the guy who did the data unpacking whether it's the data guy or the test and evaluation guy or whatever, right? That becomes a little bit complicated. But there's no question that it's not some like AI, it's not the GPT's fault. We're never getting there with the current path we're on. It's still the company.
I gotcha. Well, I'll end with this, and this is probably crossing over into more of a philosophical question. But if we were to compare the human mind to AI, obviously at this point in time, not on any sort of even ground. But if we're talking about the human mind, right? The human mind, bunch of neurons connecting with one another and sharing information and essentially learning from experiences and surroundings and everything else and developing into a more and more complex thinking organic machine, if you will. Similarly, the AI of today is gathering information and processing it and figuring out how to take that information and use it for its prime directive, which is whatever that prime directive may be, which I think at the heart of it is what truly separates anything that we're going to create from today's AI to, even 10, 20 years from now, is that it is restricted to that prime directive, right? As it advances and the prime directive can become more and more broad and non-specific. I mean, for human beings, what is our prime directive? I think no one knows that, right? But I think in a general sense, it is to be alive and pursue happiness, perhaps.
Depends on the person.
Depends on the person. Depends on the person. But like in a general sense, I think, if you had to give a robot the most accurate prime directive that resembles a human, it would be, survive and pursue happiness. Like, just on a basic sense, right? When we get to a point, and it could tell me if you think it's not going to get to this point, but if in 20, 30 years, if we get to a point where we can give a AI model a prime directive that is broad like that, and then it has to just sort of like figure out what that means based off of like human history, human knowledge, and everything else, right? Let's then assume that we can give it artificial emotions by giving it sub programs that sort of talk to it like right now you should feel this emotion, right? Like, no, it won't feel the emotion because it doesn't have the organics behind that, but let's say it's told that, hey, you should feel this emotion, right? When we get to that point, what separates that machine from us?
Yeah. So a lot of things to unpack there, but I'll try to hit them quickly. So first, you can task an AI, whether an LLM or something else, with a pretty wide range and vague set of tasks right now. Tell me the best way to get rich, right? Tell me here's my conditions, do this. So you can do some of that vague tasking right now. The quality and reliability of the answers you get is going to be all over the map, basically depending on what it learned from the internet and how the how the statistics worked out for your specific case. Sometimes it'll be garbage, it'll spew nonsense, sometimes it'll be great. But you can do some of those broad directives. We see that with like autonomous vehicles as well. I want you to get me from here to here. I don't want to die. Go, right? There are plenty of examples of sort of those relatively, now the driving one's more specific, but you can give vague and a wide variety of things to LLMs. The difference, one of the fundamental differences is it has no fundamental understanding of the thing you're trying to accomplish. It doesn't understand concepts. And that is a fundamental difference from human intelligence, where one of the classic old school examples, they tried to train a machine learning system to tell the difference between a dog and a wolf. And they found out, when they finally figured out what it was doing, it wasn't even looking at the animal. It was just looking at the background and looking for snow. So it didn't even have a concept of what an animal was, or a dog or a wolf. It just knew that things that have dogs in them don't tend to have snow and things. So that conceptual gap is a fundamental difference between these kinds of intelligence, even though a lot of these systems today are designed to try to mimic it. Like a neural net is philosophically supposed to be mimicked on human intelligence. It is designed in the way that human intelligence is thought to kind of work, not exactly, but pretty close. That's why they call it a neural net. And fundamentally, that approach has not shown any ability to really understand concepts in the way that we do. And you might be able to tell it, you should feel this emotion in this kind of state, But bear in mind, like you and I in the same state, right, might feel very different emotions. So that becomes a very difficult thing in which to encode. And so those fundamental differences between human intelligence and machines, which don't have intelligence, are going to be persistent with all of the paths that we're on right now. They are not on a path to AGI, to artificial general intelligence. And as long as they're leaning into these pattern matching solutions, they will be able to do very powerful things. And some of the interactions will feel very human. ChatGPT is very convincing and sometimes very right. However, it is not like talking to a human or a PhD expert in your pocket. The real danger comes in when we think that it is, and we treat it like it is. So in 10, 20, 30 years, I would expect us to be having roughly the same conversations about things like hallucinations in these systems or really dumb errors because you thought you were teaching it to look at animals and it thought it was learning how to look at snow. And those kind of deltas between our intelligence, the difference between how we see the world and the machine sees the world, just aren't going anywhere in the timeframes you're talking about based on the way we build these systems. And they're always going to be sensitive to the data that comes into them. They're always going to be sensitive to the algorithm. They're always going to be sensitive to how we tune them because there's a person deciding whether certain outputs are okay, right? That's how they fixed the Grok Nazi bot. And so when you put all of that together, you're just not getting to a human equivalent intelligence that you can hold accountable or view as its own entity in the same way. Someday, you might get to a point where you could write code and you had a machine that literally looked like a human brain, which is incredibly powerful in really weird ways we don't fully understand. And on that day, when you can encode it in the same way and have sensory inputs the same way and have it learn in the world, then we can have a discussion about the meaning of free will and whether pre-coded math in a digital box is fundamentally different than a human born with a set of electrons. Right. But we're not there yet.
I'm not, let's just put religion on a shelf for a moment, right? Like we're not even going to get into religion.
But in terms of like as a legal entity, right? Like right, the fundamental difference.
Biologically, we're just talking biologically. Like, let's assume that like we're not talking about souls and religion. Just this thing here, right?
Yes.
Like this thing here, which you need in order to like exist as a person on the physical realm, right? Is this thing here something you can just replicate in a machine setting and a code setting to the point where it's like, this is a person, but it's not?
So today, absolutely not. In the next 10 years, absolutely not. In the next 20, 30 years, I don't think so either. And even if you could, right, even if you could create the physical entity that is this brain, right, and all of the electrical connections and all of the mechanics, which again, you definitely can't. But in a world in which you could, in order for it to be treated as an independent entity in a way that would affect how you would treat it in law, or in how you would treat it in sort of the worlds that you're talking about, like all of the data it was exposed to then take those connections and turn them into intelligence would fundamentally shape its intelligence. So somebody is responsible for how it gets out into the world, what it's trained on, what those guardrails were, what that code was. And if that bot turns into a serial killer, right?
Right? Like kind of like a human child, right?
You gave it the learning ability, you gave it the thing, and you set it loose on the world. And unless you are going to say that is like fundamentally the same as what a parent does with a child, and therefore the parent is not responsible, and that's where I was making the comment about like an entity and free will. Like, unless you just believe that the electrons we're born with and like the structure of the brain and how it evolves is exactly analogous to this, and therefore the concept of an individual or free will just doesn't exist anymore. Like, you can't get to the place where this digital recreation is the same.
Because you would have to then say that like we don't we're just really complex computers. We don't realize that we actually don't have free will because
somebody deliberately created and built that artificial one, right?
Right.
I have a 7-month-old, and I didn't go in and create all the neuronal connections, right? Like, I didn't knowingly create the goodness or the badness in his brain. If you built this machine in a lab, somebody built it. Somebody wrote the code that did that. And so ultimately, if it has product defects, that is on the responsibility of them, because unlike me, they had control of what was created.
Isn't it true though that the code becomes so long and convoluted that it really isn't even, you can't even like review it from a human standpoint? You would actually need AI to review the code of another AI.
So yeah, and that's one of the arguments you'll hear is that these things are so big and so complex and so whatever that you can't, how could the coder be expected? And my counterpoint to that is just because I don't understand what the thing I'm doing that I'm releasing out of the world is going to do doesn't mean it's not my fault when bad things happen.
Yeah.
Right? Like I didn't know that this crazy whatever that I built is going to nuke New York City. That doesn't mean that it's not my fault. And so as you build, one of the problems with these black boxes that they're building that are trained on this incredibly complicated data set is that they can't do the evaluation of every possible thing that could happen, right? Again, if they had thought to check for Nazi bot, they probably wouldn't have released it, but they didn't catch it. And if it hadn't been a Nazi bot, it would have been something else. And that's where the liability conversation, if you're going to sell this thing and put it out into the world and it's going to do bad things, the fact that you put this thing out there that can do that ultimately is on you. If somebody wasn't maliciously using, right? This isn't like gun manufacturing where you can get into debates about a lot of this stuff and somebody pulled the trigger, guns don't kill people, people kill people. If the person didn't know because of the way you sold it, marketed it, et cetera, and the way that interface that it could do these bad things, and it does, it becomes a real conversation about product liability. And the fact that what you built is super complicated is kind of on you.
Yeah.
So, I think people are going to have that defense, Lou. They are going to say, this code is so complicated we couldn't test everything. And I'm going to say, if you can't guarantee performance, are you sure you should be releasing it out in the world? And shouldn't you be accountable for the things that fail when you do?
All right, David, it was a pleasure. Do you have any final comments that you'd like to make? We covered, I think, a pretty good swath of things.
No, I mean, I really appreciate the time. I think the main thing that I would take away is that, especially if you're in the legal space, you have to be really conscious of treating AI like it fundamentally changes the conversation. The law is still the law, and a lot of the things that people do with AI are illegal already. And the things that you might choose to use AI to do, you're still accountable for. So if you're using a tool that you don't fully understand and it generates a legal brief with fake citations or misrepresented information, it's still on you. And similarly, like if somebody commits a cybercrime using AI, it's still just a crime. And so making sure that you understand that AI is an intelligence, that it's pattern matching, and that the terms of use for software still apply and it's a software product, I think it's really critical for people who are being exposed to this and sold these capabilities, understand that, and do things like review the terms of use and see if they're willing to take on liability if their tool makes an error that might result in you being disbarred.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think the takeaway from this is, AI is this thing that we have put so much cultural, like, science fiction to, right? There's too much science fiction revolving around AI, and we as a people, I think, have given it its own sort of identity. And what we call AI right now just is not what
If
it
if
is in our
somebody's
science fiction, and it's
if you're
not
talking to
close to
someone
getting.
talking to you about AI and making promises and telling you how it works, substitute the words fancy math or pattern matching and see if it still makes sense.
Yeah, there you go.
Or better yet, ask them to define AI and then ask them how it works, whether it works, and what proof they have that it works, and whose fault it is when it doesn't, the same way you would for anything else you bought.
All right, David, thank you so much for being on with us. Everybody, if you need to have some consulting and how AI can help your company, give David a call, and I'll see everybody next time.
Thanks, Lou.
Thanks for listening in. And a quick note, you may have noticed some of the artwork is different. Some of the visuals are different. Well, we are spinning off a more robust version of the show over at Louis Casadia's Lace Law YouTube channel. That's LACELAW. We invite you to join us there. There's going to be a mix of content between that New Jersey Criminal Podcast and some of the other podcast legal channels that I produce. So Lou's expanding, and we invite you to join us. That's Lace Law on YouTube.